Hello, Connecting Point. We are back in 1 Samuel chapter 4 this week, and I want to start this week with a table talk question, and this is your question. What is a covenant? So maybe a little odd to start at asking about this kind of concept of covenant with the events that we're going to be covering this week, but the events that we're covering this week are going to be Israel going into battle with the Philistines and losing the Ark of the Covenant. And so I thought it was an interesting thing to think about. What is a covenant, and what does it represent? What is the Ark actually supposed to represent for the people of Israel? God frequently deals with humankind through the use of covenants in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, Jesus identifies communion as being emblematic of a new covenant, which he writes in his own blood. The Bible Project describes the idea of a covenant as a couple of different things. One of these is a partnership between God and humankind. And so that's the example that they give is the idea of where God creates humankind and puts them into the garden, with his good creation, and setting them up as his image in the garden to work the garden. God is not going to work the garden himself. He's partnering with humankind to care for creation. But as the story goes, of course, humankind fails to live up to their end of the covenant of creation, and so the remainder of the story of Scripture shows God calling people back into that type of creation care relationship. So to this end, the Bible Project further goes on to describe covenant as an agreement where God makes a promise and then asks for the specific humans that he's making the covenant with to make a commitment. So an example for that would be like the Abrahamic covenant, where God promises to make Abraham's descendants numerous, many nations, and then that he's going to bless Abraham to be a blessing, and that all of humankind is going to be blessed through Abraham's family. In return, what does he ask of Abraham? Well, he gives him the ritual of circumcision, but he also he asks him to commit to teaching his children the ways of faith and righteousness. You can kind of start to think about further on as Moses goes up the mountain to go through this whole covenantal process on behalf of the whole nation of Israel, which we studied a few years ago in Deuteronomy, and when they renewed the covenant that they had with God. Now, thinking about that, this story this week shows the Israelites actually appealing to the God of the covenant in some sense, and then God not coming through for them. And so I want you to think about why that would be the case as we go through the story. So we're going to start by reading chapter 4 of 1 Samuel, and we're going to pause actually after verse 11. So here we go, 1 Samuel 4 and verse 1. And Samuel's word came to all Israel. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." And so the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all of Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They're the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." And so the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers, and the ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So Nicole left us last week reasserting this idea that Samuel, this young fella, had stepped into the role that Eli, and even to a greater extent his two profligate sons, Hophni and Phinehas, had vacated with their self-serving attitudes. They were irreligious men who treated the covenant that they had with God in this flippant way. And Samuel takes God seriously, and that's the big one of the big pieces of like marks of difference between the character sets in chapter 3 of 1 Samuel. And so that's going to be one of the key ideas that I want you to hold, because we're actually just taking a pause from Samuel almost entirely this week. So this sequence from verses 1 to 11 is very interesting, and at first blush, I thought it was interesting that the Israelites are almost kind of doing things correctly, thinking to bring the ark back into battle, which was part of its role during the conquest. Joshua and the Israelite army would show up, and the ark would be with them, and that would be kind of a visible symbol of God's presence with them as they went into their fights with the various Canaanite tribes that they were having to prosecute this war with. The army would be buoyed by its presence on the battlefield, and they enjoyed success, almost like unstopped success, except for a couple of minor setbacks. But it was also that way during the Torah battles that you can read about in Numbers and some of them in Exodus. Moses, they have the ark eventually, and then they carry it with them everywhere they go. So when they have to go into battle against the Amalekites or the Moabites or whoever it is, they're going to have the ark with them. So here they are actually doing what their ancestors had done. And remember, this is coming out of the time of Judges when they're going all over the place. So here it looks like, well, maybe are they recovered? Like, have they recovered some of their religiosity? Have they recovered some of their sense of who they are and who God is? I don't know. It doesn't seem to work that way. But we should talk a little bit about who their enemy is before we get into unpacking exactly why it is that the Israelites lose this week. So the Philistines are going to be the main adversary for Israel throughout the Samuel narrative. Doug is probably going to pick up a little bit more of them next week and talk about some of their worship practices. But I'll take more of a historical perspective with the Philistines. So the usual understanding of who they are is that they're a migrant sea people who arrived in Palestine probably sometime during the 11th century BC, so 100 years, 200 years before our story this week. Maybe not even that far. So what had happened during the 12th and 11th centuries is what's called the Bronze Age collapse, or the Dark Age of the Bronze Age, and it's between when the High Bronze Age, and that's the time of the Egyptians and the Babylonians, the early Babylonians, and then they kind of dip into a Dark Age. There's just less cultural artifacts from that time. There's less writing that we have from that time. And so it seems like there was a couple of cataclysms around the Mediterranean world, earthquakes and stuff like that, that caused a lot of migration and a lot of upheaval, and big kingdoms were kind of brought down during that time period. It's one of the reasons why Israel is actually poised to become a regional power under David and Solomon, is because there aren't these large kingdoms around them. That is the state of things for most of the Hebrew history. So, but the Philistines are the sea people. They probably come from Cyprus or Crete. They're seafarers, but they also have iron chariots. And so what they end up doing is they end up conquering a strip along the coastal plain of Palestine, which is now the Gaza Strip, and they have 5 cities in that region, significant ones, and they're never really able to expand beyond that. And one of the theories is that their chariots weren't of much use once they got further interior, where it gets more hilly and rugged in the terrain. And the Israelites didn't bother using chariots, so they just kind of end up in this stalemate where the Israelites can hold the high ground, the rugged ground, and the Philistines can hold the coastal plain. Now, what's going to end up happening, we'll see, is that Saul is going to have some success against the Philistines, and then later on David is going to have great success against the Philistines. By the time of Solomon, they're not a serious problem any longer for the Israelites. So the Israelites do end up winning this, but for these centuries that we're talking about, starting with back in the Judges, Samson's dealing with the Philistines. But they kind of go back and forth for a couple of centuries, where for a time one will oppress the other, then they'll switch roles. And that's kind of the nature of things for that. You see in this sequence that the Philistines are somewhat aware of the Exodus story. Now, in the scholarship, there's some doubt about how much of this is an embellishment from the Hebrew writer of our narrative, but I do think it's reasonable to believe that it's not a fabrication, and that there would have been at least rumor of the great power of the Hebrew God, from the Philistines' perspective, right? The God, or they call them the gods in our text here, and they see this whole battle sequence as something of a power struggle between the gods of the Hebrews, as it were, and the gods of the Philistines. And so we are set up with this expectation by the way that the story sets it up. And then our expectations are subverted as the Israelites go into battle and lose. And the Philistines end up taking it to them. So why is this? Well, there's two verbs that I want you to notice as we read through this text, and they're in verses 3 and 4. The first of these verbs is take, which in the NIV translation that I read, it's rendered as bring. In the Hebrew, the verb to take is often a cue for you to look for sin happening. In Genesis, Eve sees the fruit and takes it. Later on in Genesis, when Sarah and Abraham are still barren, Sarah sees Hagar and takes her to give her to Abraham to try to speed up the process of making many nations out of Abraham, right? Later on in our narrative, David is going to see Bathsheba and then take her and commit adultery with her, and it's going to be a big disaster. It's emblematic of kind of the softness of his power that he or the softness that comes, the moral softness that comes as he gets more comfortable in his power as king. So here, what the Israelite elders do is they think to take the Ark of the Covenant and then try to use it on their own terms. The second verb is that the army sends to Shiloh. They send men out to Shiloh. And then, lo and behold, Hophni and Phinehas are there, and then they don't do anything about stopping this misuse of the symbol of Israel's covenant. In fact, they just go ahead and accompany the ark out to the battlefield. As we go through the Samuel narrative, you're also going to see the verb to send used for someone who's in authority. And it's important when you see the verb send, who is doing the sending? Because they're a person who is implying that they have the right to do this authoritative act as this kind of a thing. So in this circumstance, what we see is the Israelite army and elders take the Ark of the Covenant and they send for God, right? We're going to send out, we need God with us now. You know what though, but we're going to send for him. He's going to come and do our bidding, right? And that's exactly the crux of the problem of this story. The elders have their relationship with God exactly backwards. They take God out to the battlefield to do their will. They send for God when it's convenient. But God is no respecter of this kind of behavior. He's no respecter of persons. And the Israelites are, they're confused about what this is. They're seeking to use him as like a charm or a magical talisman or something like that. Joshua 5 shows us how God operates in warfare. And what happens in that sequence is that they're conquering Jericho, and there's an angel of the Lord standing outside the city. And Joshua walks up to him and he says, "Whose side are you on? The side of Jericho or our side?" And he says, "Neither. I'm on my own side." And Joshua rightly worships the Lord in this moment because he sees that there's a spiritual dynamic that goes beyond. And the issue is that his will be conformed to God's, not that God is going to work on my behalf because I'm such a nice guy or because of who my ancestors are, whatever the people are thinking that they're doing, right? Joshua rightly reveres God and seeks to be conformed to his ways and plans, and then he has success because now his plans are being governed by godly thinking, not that he's got his own thinking and he tries to work God into it, right? These elders have failed to understand the covenant properly, that God makes promises, but he asks for commitments, right? And he gets to be the one who dictates the terms of those things. We don't, right? So that leads me to our first table talk, I guess it's our second table talk. What are the ways that we fail to understand our relationship with God and maybe seek to manipulate him for our own ends? And how can we guard against this? So the battle doesn't go well, and it's a disaster, complete military disaster for the people of Israel. And let's read now of how the news of this military disaster comes home to Eli. So we'll pick up in verse 12. That same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh, with his clothes torn and dust on his head, When he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching, because his heart feared for the ark of God. When the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" The man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old, and whose eyes had failed, so that he could not see. He told Eli, "I've just come from the battle line. I fled from it this very day." Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The man who brought the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines. The army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off of his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man, and he was heavy. He had led Israel 40 years. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. As she was dying, the women attending her said, "Don't despair, you've given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention, and she named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband." She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Now, this is tragic and sad, but we should also see some kind of ironic dark humor in this whole sequence, with blind, heavy old Eli on the lookout, watching for what has happened to the battle, right? And that's where we start with our sequence. We get a picture here of the failure of Eli at its fullness. He's unable to see now, symbolizing, as Nicole said last week, a lack of zeal, maybe, for the Lord. And his lack of awareness of the depths of sin and failure of the religious and political establishment, of which he is, kind of like a figurehead and an integral part. He had led Israel for 40 years after all, right? Eli's also very large now, right? Which is one of the things that he and his sons are accused of being guilty of, is fattening themselves with the offerings of the people of Israel. And you'll recall that from a couple weeks back, 1 Samuel 2 verse 29, the man of God comes and gives a prophecy to Eli, and that's one of the accusations, that they're making themselves fat with the choice parts of the offerings of the people of Israel. That 40-year mark is also an interesting one to note symbolically, as each of the 3 kings of united Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon, will have 40-year reigns. And 40 is this representative time frame for completeness or fullness, right? So the fullness of Eli's failure, the fullness of the time of the judges also sort of seems to be at its end. And Samuel, the kingmaker, is about to enter the picture as the final judge. The other kind of funny piece is that the words for heaviness and glory are very similar. It's kavod is the Hebrew word. And so when when Eli's daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, says that the glory has departed, there's puns to be made in there about, that fat Eli is now departed from this life, right? But that's not exactly what she's getting at. I think the author's giving us a little bit of this humor, and it's kind of a dark humor in the light of this tragedy for the nation of Israel. And it is interesting to note that at the end sequence, we get that clear-eyed woman, Phinehas' wife, who's understanding what is going on in the state of Israel. And an interesting thing to see is both Hannah and then this unnamed wife of Phinehas get to have these significant roles explaining the moral state of Israel at this point in their history. She goes into labor under the duress of the news she receives and gives this prophetic name of Ichabod for Eli's grandson. Now, that name, Ichabod, means the glory has departed, but departed isn't quite a strong enough word. That's the word we use in the NIV because it's got a nice little ring to it, a nice little phraseology to it. But the verb that we want to note in that idea is exile. And in some way, this whole story about Eli and his sons and his house is a microcosm of what is about to happen to Israel over the next 300 to 400 years, where they have the outward show of being a Yahweh following people, but there's some rot in at the core. And it's a moral rot, and it's going to rear its terrible, ugly head as they sin in more and more egregious ways and end up going into exile in the nations of Assyria and then later Babylon. But I don't want to leave us with only this note of seeing that Israel's completely at this cultural collapse moment, right? Where even the symbols of their religious life are being, now taken over by pagan peoples. And we're going to see more about that story next week. Doug gave us this note of hope a couple weeks back, that even as Eli's house, this house of the religious establishment, this house that shows the failures of the authorities in the land, was becoming more and more apparent. There is this nameless man of God who shows up and arrives into the story, who speaks truth and life. So even as now, a couple chapters later, we have the glory exiled from Israel and taken by the Philistines, the glory of the Lord, as it were, right? Phinehas' wife doesn't quite have a whole picture of what is going on, because God hasn't actually abandoned Israel. The symbol has, the ark has. They've broken their part of the covenant. But we actually even have a man of God who is named at the beginning of this chapter. We're not just left with these kind of nameless guys who are, kind of in and out of the picture. We actually have a guy who's going to be a big part of the revival of the religious and political life of this people. And that's Samuel, and that's who we started with actually back at verse 1, where Nicole left us last week. He ends up acting in our story as the voice of earnest faithfulness, of the truly religious, of a man who knows what it is to interact with God during a time of irreligion, confusion, of people doing what is right in their own eyes. But Samuel shows them this other way. And this is a mark of the prophetic ministry that Samuel really kind of inaugurates in a lot of ways, is that when things look bad or bleak for, the ways that we would expect to look at success, right? We should learn to look at what else is going on, because we probably don't have the full picture of what God is doing. Phinehas' wife is right. The glory has departed from Israel. But she doesn't see the entirety of what's going on. She doesn't think about how this upstart Ephraimite kid, Samuel, is going to be a significant figure in helping the nation of Israel to kind of recover and revive, even as things look pretty bleak for the state at this point. So as we finish up today, I want you to take a little bit of time to think about these different characters in this story and where you see yourself. I know sometimes that's a funny thing to do, is to kind of try to empathize with the stories, but I think that's why we get so much of the Bible written in narrative, is to try to figure out how to empathize with these people who are interacting with God in some way. I know when I read the story, I was feeling a little Phinehas' wife-ish. Like, I'm looking around at the culture and just seeing a lot of the weird news stories, and then seeing the way the church, like the orthodox and authentic church of God, seems to be kind of on the retreat. But I need to remember not to be stuck thinking so small about what God is up to, because God's work is bigger than what I can see. And my job is to work to be like that man of God, or like Samuel, to be faithful to speak what I have, and what I have is, from the Word of God, right? It's not just stuff that comes up out of my own mind. So I want you to take some time to think about that new covenant that we have with Christ, where Jesus both speaks and acts out its terms. I want you to think about these characters in the story, and I want you to kind of, reflect on them as seems fit to you. Here's a table talk question to guide that reflection. What are the promises that God has made to you? And what are the commitments God asks of you? And take some time to pray with one another. We'll see you next time.